this is Rosie, and this is my final project for Global History. I'm going to be talking about the impact of the historical narratives embraced by the British education system about the British Empire on British and ex-colonial relations and identities. So my context with this is that up until about 5 years ago, I was a pupil in a British secondary school. Throughout my history teaching, I learnt mostly pre-1066, a little bit of Tudors, and then World War I, the interwar period, and World War II. And we did those periods over and over and over again, and learned very, very little else about the history of Britain, and certainly not the history of any other country other than Germany. So what are the narratives around the British Empire? Well, a lot of British children don't study the Empire very much, if at all. Less than 14% of students who take GCSE examinations at the age of 16 study the history of the Empire, which is 2 out of 7 students who take history GCSE. There are 2 exam boards that allow students to study the Empire, and those are OCR and AQA. OCR, the topic is the impact of empire on Britain from 1688 to 1730, which covers very little ground in the history of the empire, and only studies the impact of the empire on Britain, which is a generally positive impact. A lot of economic advance, industrial revolution, and a lot of things like that. AQA offers Britain, migration, empires, and the people from 790 to the present day, which is a hugely broad time period, and mostly studies, if you look at the syllabus, the immigrant paths of British people through the world, and then the immigration of people to Britain. A lot of those immigrants were from colonies. When the empire is taught, it's often very one-sided. In some schools it'll be a civics class on why we should be nicer to other people, and it'll be used as an example. In other classes it'll be a history class, a glorified, this is why we're called Great Britain class. A lot of people argue
there is so much historical amnesia about what the empire really entailed. The fact that you don't really teach colonial history in your schools. Children doing A-levels in history don't learn a line of colonial history. There's no real awareness of the atrocities, the fact that Britain financed its industrial revolution and its prosperity from the depredations of empire. The fact that Britain came to one of the richest countries in the world in the early 18th century and reduced it after 200 years of plunder to one of the poorest. But all of that is really not known anymore.
This is difficult stuff, because we're just about to try and do a big deal with you. We need your trade. Are you going to hold this against us?
Not at all. I don't really think this is about today's relations, which are between 2 sovereign equal countries, John. I mean, our economy is as big as yours now. And as far as we're concerned, I think we don't need to have a chip on our shoulder when dealing with you. But I think we do need to be aware of history, because, as I often say to young people, if you don't know where you've come from, how will you appreciate where you're going?
Lots of people argue that the British colonial period should be taught in schools as a way of giving British children from any background the opportunity to learn about their past and about the impact that Britain has had on the world and the impact that the world has had on Britain in the last century. There are a lot of consequences associated with not studying the British Empire in schools. There's a big impact on white British children who don't recognise British influence in the world, who don't realise the huge consequences of British colonialisation on the world. So we have America, we have England, we have Europe, we have all of these places that are world cultural hubs that dictate the fashions, the movies, the books, the language, the religion of a large majority of the world. We dictate beauty standards, we dictate all kinds of things. We are, the race and the language and the culture that is seen as dominant in the Western world. and is seen as dominant in the Western world. So there's a real impact when children aren't taught the history behind why that is. So there's this gap in their knowledge of the world. There's also a big impact on multicultural children in England who won't be taught about how their families came to be in England, how their mother country was affected by British rule, and so they lose out on that connection to their grandparents, their great-grandparents, their great-great-grandparents. They miss out on that connection between their home country and their current home country, the nationality of being British. So they miss out on that link, and that seems like a very unfair thing to do to children. So why don't we study the British Empire in schools? Well, the national curriculum is written by the government and government bodies, and the government can't agree on how to teach the empire. Should we be apologetic? Should we use it as an example of social justice, an example of cross-cultural collaboration, a lesson in global economy, a lesson about British values as espoused by the School Inspection Board, right here. How should the empire be taught? It's a really difficult question that historians and history teachers and history curriculum designers really struggle with, especially with a very limited amount of time in which to teach history to children. What do you prioritise? What is the aim of teaching history? Should the aim be for children to have an understanding of where their country comes from and where it's going? Should it be to have a skill set in reading and writing and critical thinking? What is the goal of teaching history? And that's a very, very difficult question for a government body to answer. And without an answer to that question, it's difficult to know whether you're supposed to be inspiring national pride, whether you're supposed to be inspiring critical thinking about patriotism. And until we figure that out, it's very difficult for anybody to decide how or what we're going to teach about one of the most controversial periods of history in Britain. Another reason that the British Empire is not taught in schools is because we, as a country, have never had to have a drastic rethink of our national values. So if we look at Germany as a counterexample, World War II forced countries like Germany to really reevaluate their worldviews, to take stock of their past, to accept it, to move on and to try to be better. They worked very, very hard on redefining a national identity, on redefining what it means to be German. And to that end, the Holocaust and General World War II is a very important topic in German schools. And whereas Britain was never invaded or defeated by an opposition, and so has never had to have this dramatic rethink of cultural identity and cultural values. There is this phrase right here that I think really describes why the British Empire is not taught. There was never a bang, like we have to make sure that we teach what we did and how we moved from this point to this point. And so there's this definite lack of consideration for this section of history, because it's not as important to us as it is, for example, for the Germans to show World War II in their studies of history in schools. But why should we study the empire? Well, the empire as a school topic would explain Britain's relationships to other countries. It explains why we are close to the Commonwealth countries, the voluntary membership of the Commonwealth. It explains why we have such close relationships with the Western world, because a lot of them are rooted in British colonialism. There's North America, Australia, a lot of places that are very, very rooted in British culture and British values, because the dominant culture in those countries began as British. The empire as a topic also explains why Britain itself is so diverse. It explains, it's because World War One was fought with Empire troops. There's a lot of people here died and fought and were present in Gallipoli, in Dunkirk, and this history, this involvement of colonial troops is almost completely ignored in school studies of World War One, which means that people aren't being taught what is necessary for them to be taught in order to understand why Britain is so diverse. It also explains racial relations in the UK and serves as a conversation starter for conversations about racism. As you can see from this quote, all the way through colonial history, the people who were coming to Great Britain and who were settling and who were being involved in British culture, those who were white, from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, were much more accepted into British society because of their skin colour and because of their culture being seen as still being British than people from India and from other countries where people are not white and where people were not moving from Britain to India. Britain's relationship with India, with African countries, was much more supervisory than integrative. And so this conversation helps children to learn about racism and about racial relations in the UK. The controversy of this topic also helps children to learn about the way in which we write and understand history and how to take diverse ideas into a point of view, how to pull diverse ideas into your worldview. So there's a very interesting conversation to be had here about the global versus the local in the view of the British Empire. How is the empire viewed in India, in North America, in Western Commonwealth countries, in Africa? How is it viewed in Great Britain? And what's the difference between those local and those global perspectives? As we saw in the video earlier, India, to some extent, wants reparations. They want their artefacts back. They want an apology note. The same guy who spoke in that video has said on several occasions that he would be fine if Great Britain paid the Indian government £200, £1 for every year that the empire colonised India, was in charge of India. So people want acknowledgement of the crimes, the war crimes that were clearly committed in Great Britain, in the Great British Empire. North America is a fascinating example that celebrates both independence from the British, but also Thanksgiving, from when British came and killed all the natives. The Western Commonwealth is working to acknowledge their histories. Canada apologising for residential schools for Canadian Indians. New Zealand working to incorporate native history and native history and narratives into government, into flags. And then Great Britain, to a large extent, ignoring the history, and in certain instances making formal apologies and informal apologies for very specific atrocities that were committed. There's a general view in Britain that, especially from the older generation, that colonizing the world was a good thing. We brought civilization and railways and the postal service to all kinds of uncivilized places around the world. There's an overwhelming narrative in Great Britain of people believing that they know a lot about the positive aspects of the British Empire, which is great. and should be celebrated. The good parts of the empire should not be forgotten, but should also be taking into account on a much greater level the negative impact that Britain had on the non-Western countries that they colonised, and the economies that they damaged, the cultures that they ruined, the languages that they wiped out. There's also something to be said for the world language and the world culture that the empire helped to create. The Western society around the world is fairly homogenous, has a lot of interconnectivity, and that is mostly down to the spread of English as a language, of Christianity as a religion, of liberal government, of democracy through the world that happened through British colonialisation. So, in conclusion, British history is clouded and convoluted, and it's difficult to know what is true and what is an exaggeration and what is a narrative that is being erased and what is a narrative that is being propagated, and what of those narratives are actually true. It's very hard to know any of those things, which makes it very, very difficult to teach topics like this, such controversial topics, in schools that are controlled by the government. It's very difficult to teach anti-government or anti-patriotic sentiment in a school, but at the same time, you can't have a school teaching patriotism. So it's very hard to know where to draw boundaries and where to what to teach and how to teach it. I think that taking into account the views of the colonised as well as the colonisers, and trying to draw these narratives together, and appreciate the stories of all of the cultures involved in British colonialism and in the British Empire, is not only an excellent exercise in critical thinking, but also an incredibly important part of a British child's education, in understanding where they come from and the impact that Great Britain has had on the world and will continue to have on the world, and the impact that the colonies have had on Great Britain. Thank you so much for listening. It's been great to speak to you. Thank you.